Welcome to Beyond Speaking with Brian Lord, a podcast featuring deeper conversations with the world's top speakers.
Hi, I'm Brian Lord, your host for the Beyond Speaking podcast. Our guest today is Kindra Hall. She is a best-selling author and chief storytelling officer of Success Magazine. She teaches leaders, executives, and entrepreneurs across countless industries to harness and leverage the power of their stories. Her earlier book, Stories That Stick, debuted at number 2 on the Wall Street Journal bestseller list, and Forbes said it may be the most valuable business book you read. Her new book, Choose Your Life, Change Your Story, has a new twist on that and releases on January 11th. So Kindra, thank you so much for joining us.
Brian, I am so happy to be here. It's great to hear your voice. It's good to see you.
Yeah, it's nice seeing you too. And we've worked with you a long time, and I'm finally getting to interview you. I know you've been on the podcast before with someone else here at Premiere. And so I'm excited that I finally get my turn here. And I love storytelling. Like, that's the whole idea. Whenever I talk to people, you're coming on this podcast, please tell great stories. That's what I'm looking for here. What got you interested in stories in the first place?
You know, I was one of those people, Brian, who found, and in the speaking world, people will be like, oh, that topic, or oh, that lane. But before there were topics or lanes, or I even knew what speaking was, I found storytelling. Or I like the way I think about it is stories found me. I told my first story when I was 11. It was an assignment for 5th grade. We were supposed to take a children's, it was actually kind of like the first foray into public speaking, which I love as a skill. They were teaching it so young. We were supposed to choose a children's book and then go read it to a 3rd or 4th grade classroom. That was the assignment. So I chose my book, and I remember reading it and going home and thinking to myself that it might be a lot more interesting if I didn't read it, if I just kind of told it and brought it to life. And so I added characters to it, and I added, there was like action and I remember, I didn't remember. This is a story my mother told me of what she remembered, was that I came home and said, Mom, we have to tell this story for English class. Can I practice for you? And she sat down on our living room floor, on the floor with her back like against the couch. And I stood up in front of the room, in the living room, and told this story. And she said, it was one of those moments. I don't know. I mean, I know you have kids. I had one of those moments not long ago, just with my son. We were out at dinner and he started talking about Mayan mathematics in this like crazy, we actually have a photo of me listening to him talk about it and being like, I don't even understand what is happening here. And my mother had that similar experience sitting on the living room floor when I started telling this story. She said, I wasn't even sure what I was seeing, but I was seeing something. And so I told that story. And then, I had a series of mentors all throughout my life who kind of guided me on this path without even really realizing that's what they were doing. It was kind of like this idea of storytelling brought on a life of its own, in that it was like, oh, we need this teacher to encourage you to do it here. And we need this person from your church to encourage you to tell a story here. And I remember, I'm just going to give you the long story. I remember being in high school and I was on the speech team, which we have this big debate in my family because my husband was a big, Division I. He played water polo at UCLA, which that is about, he has multiple friends who are Olympic medalists. Like he was the creme de la creme when it came to, pursuing sports. And then here I was, the girl on the speech team. And when we talk about what our kids are going to do, what are we going to encourage them? How are we going to foster their interest? I was like, I just want to point out, you are not a professional water polo player. I, on the other hand, like speak for a living. So that's always a fun little debate that we have in our house. But I was on the speech team, and there were categories in on the speech team. So you could do dramatic interpretation. And my category happened to be storytelling, which is just wild. And so I was competitively telling stories and was really good at it. Like it was again what I was meant to do. And a coach from another team, Brian, actually, I'll never forget, it was printed on that like salmon colored paper, that kind of like orange, but it was salmon. I don't even know if they make that color anymore, but it was salmon colored. A coach from another team, her name was Kathleen Westgard. She handed my coach this flyer that said like National Youth Storytelling Olympics, and said, I think Kindra needs to apply for this. Like, I think she needs to enter this competition. And it happened at East Tennessee State University. And you were supposed to submit a VHS tape. And I remember at the time, I think I was like a junior in high school, and I was very interested in being a high school kid. Like yes, I was doing speech and theater and all of that. I wanted to be with my friends. I wanted to go to prom. Like that was really where my interests were, if I'm totally honest, much to the dismay of my parents. And my parents kept encouraging, they're like, you need to work on your scholarship essays. You need to be, I mean, I come from a very modest background. If I wanted to go to college, it needed to be scholarships, and they were just on me all the time. And everybody, just as a high school kid. And so one day they were so annoying about it that I decided to rebel. This is how I rebelled. I hope this is how my kids rebel. Instead of submitting a scholarship essay, I was going to enter this storytelling competition. I was going to show them, which they were really excited that I entered this storytelling competition. But I ended up finding where to mail the tape. I mailed the tape, and then things started to, it was like another door opened up. And I think that's kind of, and I think if any of us were to look back on the stories of our lives, it's a series of doors opening up. And I ended up going to that competition, winning that competition, and the grand prize was not a college scholarship. So we'll just say that. But it was that you got to tell at the National Storytelling Festival, which happens in Jonesboro, Tennessee every year, which is right next to Johnson City, Kingsport. You fly into the tri-state or the Tri-City airport. I think Bristol is the other city in that little triangle. Anyway, Jonesboro, Tennessee, this tiny town. It probably still doesn't have a stoplight, but every first weekend in October, it floods with 15,000 people. And it can be snowing or it can be scalding hot. But they put up these huge circus tents and bring in storytellers. And it's really important to know that these storytellers they're just there to tell stories. They're not there with an agenda. They're not trying to sell anything. And so I got to tell at this festival, which gave me an incredible opportunity because I was so young to be taken under the wing of these amazing storytellers. But number two, I remember sitting under this circus tent, and I was there with my mom, and all these people from all different backgrounds listening to these storytellers. And I could see it was definitely an experiment for me to see all these people so different from me, so different from each other, all connecting to this one teller. And it didn't matter where they were from or what stories there were folk tales, there were personal stories. Some of them were big stories. Some of them were just these very small moments from life that these tellers were able to recognize the power of that moment and the bigger message, or just the bigness of any given moment of our life, which so often we all overlook. And the unification of these stories and the power that had. But B, for me, it was a lot like, I only saw The Matrix once in high school. And I will admit I was on a double date and it made no sense to me. And my husband, I had no idea what it was about. And my husband just made me watch the new Matrix, and he was like talking. And I'm like, you understand this? I'm pretty sure that this movie makes very little sense to someone who knows what the Matrix is about. It makes they might as well, I like need you to be my subtitles for the Matrix. But I do remember from the first version where they would see things like happen in front of them, like on almost like a screen, like they could just see the world differently. And that's what sitting at that storytelling festival was like for me. I was seeing the arcs of the stories and the components and the things that were working and the way that they were moving the audience. And so really from that moment on, it became very clear to me that storytelling was going to be a part of my future. I didn't know how, but then I went to college, and my research projects were on storytelling in organizations. I went on to graduate school where my thesis was on the role of storytelling in organizational socialization, how company cultures are built or broken based on the stories that are told. Then I went into sales and marketing, where it was all about the stories that were being told. Nonprofit organizations. You told me I could tell long stories. So
hey, go for it. Go for it.
I was volunteering on a big committee, and I was in charge of this silent auction and event. And it was a small event. It was like 75 people. It was designed to be that way. And there was a silent auction, and silent auctions are just the worst. They're just so, you just, and I was sitting there, and we're getting all these random things in, like somebody donated a mattress, somebody donated a dog bed, somebody donated like plastic surgery, like a facelift or something, like all these random, and how do you, like a really great watch. And so and I wanted the numbers to come back great. So I remember sitting down and writing a story for each one of the items and like packaging them together. Like the mattress one, I told a story about, like if you end up having to sleep in the doghouse, because it was a men's event is what it was. So it was nice because I knew who my audience was. If you end up having to sleep in the doghouse, at least you'll have a comfortable mattress, and your best friend can sleep out there with you, because I put the dog bed and the mattress together. So what happened at this event was each one then of the items had a story. And what happened was people were like crowding the silent auction table, reading every single one. And that event, it was several years ago now, but I actually just ran into a woman two falls ago. I want to say last year, because I kind of blend the last couple of years together, but who said that was still the number one fundraising silent auction the organization has ever hosted. And it really was. I mean, I knew what I was doing. I've done the research. I know the power a story can have. But then ultimately, I got this sense that, you can feed a man a fish and he'll eat for a day, or you can teach someone to fish and they'll eat for a lifetime. And I had this distinct sense that maybe what I needed to do was not just write stories for people, but actually teach them how to do it. And so that has been the main goal of my professional career since that time, which is to teach people the power of their stories, whether those stories are in business and they're the stories you tell outwardly for sales or marketing, which is what Stories That Stick, my first book, and that keynote is all about. And now, and I'm sure we can talk about this, but
yeah, well, I know. Yeah, with your new book, Choose Your Life, Change Your Story, because you're saying it's this shift off air, and it'd be great if you explain that now. How the first book was more about outward stories. Inward and outward stories are both extremely important. what would you say is the difference between that first book and this book, and how can people apply it?
So this book is, it's Choose Your Story, Change Your Life. Silence your inner critic and rewrite your life from the inside out. And what's interesting is this wasn't the book I was planning to write. Actually, it wasn't even the book I think I pitched to the publisher at first as the second book. I was planning to write a continuation of like the outward stories we tell, stories that stick, like a leader's guide, and to go more in depth on the hows and the whats and the whatnots of storytelling in organizations as you are and as you're raising leaders. But a strange thing happened. And, this is one of the great benefits of being able to share your message. And when it's in person, of course, I love doing it virtually as well, but in person, to be able to witness real time what the audience is resonating with, and in different ways, right? And from a practical sense, you can adjust or change course, but from a creation sense, what I discovered from the many events that I did is, yes, it was really important that people walked away with knowing how to tell their stories and break that down, make it very clear, really valuable. As a business strategy. But there was a piece of the keynote that I added really just right at the end out of my own desire. And this happened several years ago, where I said, okay, so now you have a great start on how to find stories for business, compelling ways to put them together, where to be telling them. But I would argue that the most important story of all are the stories we're telling ourselves. And these stories shape our understanding of who we are, where we fit in the world. And these stories, whether we know it or not, are dictating our behaviors, our actions, our decisions. And whether, that's in a very obvious way, and it's leads to progression in your career or whatever, maybe it's a more subtle life-based way, with simply siphoning off the joy and satisfaction that we feel. And I would share a story that was about one of my own limiting beliefs that had to do with work-life balance, and my belief about being this limiting belief that I had about what it meant to be a successful parent and what it meant to be a successful business person. And this belief, based on old stories of mine, was in conflict with what would allow me to really be great at both. And so I would share a story that I would tell myself anytime I could feel myself in this place of conflict, surrendering any power or joy that I had to this limiting belief. It was a story about me and my daughter. And interestingly, it didn't matter, because, we speak across all industries. It didn't matter if it was a primarily male audience or a primarily female audience. It didn't matter if they were old or young. It didn't matter if it was entrepreneurs or corporate intrapreneurs. The comment that I would hear afterwards, the emails that I would get, the messages, the people who stop you out in the lobby afterwards, and I almost missed a flight a couple of times, right? Was about this idea of the stories they were telling themselves. And it was that response that I finally decided, and even though it almost felt like a deviation in a way, of course, I'm all about storytelling. That is my passion. It's, as we said, I really didn't have a choice starting at 11. Like, this is the way it was going to go for me. But that it's one thing to talk about the skill and strategy of it, but especially right now, especially after what we've experienced the past several years, this is speaking to the psyche. We can't, if we want engaged, useful, inspired, effective, extraordinary team members, or if we want to be those people in our work, it is really important that we take control of the narratives that are running in our own minds, and giving people a path and a method for doing that, which is what Choose Your Story, Change Your Life is all about.
And that is one of the things I'm curious about. Like if someone were to say, okay, this afternoon, I want to take like one or two steps, like whether it's identifying negative stories and changing them, or focusing on positive stories. So what's like one or two steps somebody could take this afternoon after listening to this that they could sort of choose your story?
Yeah. So and you said it right there. I mean, the book is based in neuroscience of how our brain, we are natural storytellers. So whether that's a skill that you're working on outwardly, you don't have to work on it inwardly. Like we already do this. This is programmed into us. Again, this is how we understand the world and how we understand our place in it. As a result, these stories are automated. They're invisible. We don't even realize they're there, which is nice because it's one less thing that we have to think about, unless they're holding us back. And one thing that we also know is that as humans, we have a negativity bias. Again, it's built into us and it is designed to keep us safe. So those two things right off the bat, knowing that our self-stories are automatic, that you're doing it without even trying, with zero effort. These stories are happening, whether you like it or not. And B, knowing that they often have a negative bias that try to keep us safe and in place. The first step to take is to stop the automation. So something that I would recommend, if you're listening to this in your car right now, when you come to a stoplight, or, as you pull up to the office, or if you pull up at home, you turn the car off, this podcast turns off. I want you to stop for a second and ask yourself, what story am I telling myself right now? Is it, I don't have enough time? How am I ever going to get all of this done? Is it, I really messed that interview up today? Who do I think I am? Is it, oh, I need to, what? I have an important message that I need to, I have an important, like, for example, I just caught myself doing this today. I have an important email to send to an important person. I've needed to send this email for months. Months, right? And this person doesn't know, well, this person invited me to send them this email, but I have this story. Well, I just need to make sure that I really want to make sure that I know exactly what I have this story in my head that is telling me the email has to be perfect. And so I keep putting it off because it's not perfect yet. And so I'm stuck in this loop and that's one of the stories that I'm telling myself. The top line of it is, it has to be perfect in order to put it out. When really, and I'm sure there are plenty of perfectionists listening right now, whether it's an email that you have to send, a pitch, whatever it is. So that belief is built on all these different stories where I was rewarded for perfection. And I think that's the only thing. And if I don't, so to stop that automation and to realize basically your brain's playing tricks on you, and to be able to then move forward. So that would be the first thing, is to find opportunities in your day to stop and say, all right, what is playing in the background of my mind that I'm paying no attention to, and yet is dictating my life.
One thing I think is interesting too, that this isn't something you just do as an adult. This can start even younger. It makes me curious. My family too is big into storytelling. Like at Christmas time, like all the aunts and uncles sit around, and the kids, you had to tell a story. So I'm curious to know, do you build these things for your kids as well? Like the outward and the inward storytelling?
Yeah, there is. Again, I've learned my lesson not to assume I know what the next book is that I'm going to write, but this whole concept, and So the end of the book actually there's 5 chapters in there about the different areas of life where these stories play out. So business and career, money and finances, a lot of money stories, health, well-being, love and relationships, and family and parenting. And I think one of the greatest things we can do as parents is to help our children see their stories for what they are. For example, I mean, here we are, we're 2 years into this pandemic, and you often hear the phrase, well, kids are so resilient, and I don't know about yours, but my kids have been extremely resilient. I mean, they go to a public school in New York City. Like, it's required resilience on all of our parts, but just saying it to a kid, you're so resilient, doesn't do anything for them. So to take some time and think about the specific moments that required resilience from them, like their ability to, on a dime, be told that you're not going to school today at school, you're doing school at home for the next 2 weeks, to be able to navigate all the different. I mean, one night my son tried to tell me what the rules were at his school for how he was allowed to interact with his friends and in the class. I mean, I couldn't believe the amount of brain power it had to take to just know what he was allowed to do and not to do. And so I got as many details from him as I could, and I mentally recorded them, because the day will come where he's at a new job or he's in a new environment, and there are so many rules and so many different things that he's trying to navigate. And I can tell him the story of 3rd, 4th, and 5th grade and how he is more than capable of handling it. But not just to say, oh, you're capable, oh, you're so resilient, to give him the stories, because eventually over time he'll forget those stories. And it's important to know that our stories don't sound like stories to us. That's just what life was, and to draw out that, no, and that was all the way back to the beginning. And whether we're talking about the stories you're telling yourself, which I would say the second thing that I would recommend, if you ask for 2 things: number 1, to stop the automation. But the second thing is to start seeing your life in stories. Like even really small stories, moments, interactions can be used for you. You can use them later on to move you towards a goal or in a positive direction. And that was something that I saw all the way back at the National Storytelling Festival. I mentioned that they're telling these small stories from their life, and they just mean so much.
Well, I love that. And one last question here, just so I'm curious. When you were talking about the storytelling conference in Jonesboro, you were calling everyone tellers. And of course, in our industry, we're speakers. So what's the difference between a teller and a speaker, and which do you see yourself as the most?
Oh, that is a great question. The difference between a teller and a speaker, I think the tellers were there strictly for the story and the morals of the story. So there were no slides, there were no bullet points. Again, there was no agenda. There was no, what I'd like for you to take away from our time together here is A, B, and C. And actually, the morals of the story were often never even, and that is, again, there's so many things that I want to explore further, but they weren't explicitly stated. They suspended that. They weren't assigning morals. They allow each person to take from it the moral that they need, or even more so, it was just implicit in there. I find with speakers, you're there to deliver a message. There's like a tangible thing you want people to take away. I know for me, of course, when I speak, there are naturally a lot of stories, but there's also a lot of applicable, like talking about the science, talking about, okay, so here's what you do next, because that's the nature. Like here are the 4 steps. Here is what you need to take away, because I want these people in business settings, it's usually who's hiring me, to take it and do something with it. And even the speakers who the majority of their time on stage is a story, there are still bullet points, even in the program, right? Like learn how to, or whatever it is. I would say I'm in as far as part 2 of that question. Naturally, again, I will always be a storyteller. I find that the speaking, I would say right now, I consider myself a speaker who uses stories, because my goal now is for people, again, to teach a man, a woman, a child to story instead of just tell them a story. So I would say currently I consider myself a speaker who uses stories and storytelling. However, I am open to someday just telling.
That's great. Well, Kindra, thank you so much for joining us and for sharing this. And for those listening and watching, her new book comes out, Choose Your Life, Change Your Story, comes out on January 11th, which I believe is as the date that this interview is releasing. And again, you can check her out at premierspeakers.com. And on behalf of national speakers and premier speakers, thank you so much for joining us here on the Beyond Speaking podcast.
Oh, loved being here. Thank you so much for having me back, Brian.
Thank you for joining us for the Beyond Speaking podcast. To learn more about today's guest, go to beyondspeak.com. Make sure to leave a review and subscribe wherever you listen.